Hi there. Today I'm making bottles. I'm going to show you some useful techniques. The first is making the bottle form itself, how to get the height required, and then how to collar in. I'm also going to show you how to create a custom chuck that allows you to trim your bottle. Bottles look amazing in sets of varying heights, but even if you don't want to make bottles, the techniques in this video are useful when making closed forms or narrow forms like spouts. So let's get started. So I've prepared 1.3 kilos of clay and I'm just about to throw down and start centering. So here goes. I'm pushing the clay up between my palms and then pushing the clay back down with my right hand. As I push the clay back down, my left hand is supporting the clay. I'm using water whenever my hands feel dry. The water allows the clay to glide under my hands smoothly with no friction. I want to flatten the top of the clay now. I'm using the outer side of my hand with the hand at a little bit of an angle. Now that I've got my clay in the cylinder shape that I'm after, I push down and open out. I'm opening out to make a flat inner base for the bottle. Now I'm ready to pull up the walls. So pulling up the walls of the pot is a fundamental skill. It allows you to make tall pots in an efficient way. You can see here I'm doing two things. I've used my fingers to compress the top of the pot, and I'm using a sponge to remove water from the inside of the pot. See how I'm starting to pull the wall up with my fingers at the base of the pot on the outside and the other on the inside. You can see I'm leading by pushing out with the hand on the inside, and the hand on the outside is pushing the clay back in. As I move my hands upwards together, the clay is being pulled upwards. And now I start again. My fingertips to push the clay in. I can also use a knuckle, or I could use the heel of my hand. For this amount of clay, I feel comfortable using my knuckle. So as I bring my fingers up together, you can see the bulge of clay coming upwards. Cover the clay evenly as you come up, and don't come up too quickly, or you'll end up with spirals of uneven clay. I'm squeezing the top in slightly, just to keep the form very controlled, and the top a little narrower. I'm going to pull up one more time here. So remember, squeezing from the inside out and squeezing back in from the outside inwards. I need to keep my hands working together evenly. And as always, compressing the top. I'm using my arrowhead tool to trim a little around the base of the body, and now I take my rib tool and use the straight edge to run up the side of the body. So now I have the height of the cylinder. I'm going to start collaring in. Now if you look at the top view, you can see that I'm using my hands in a triangular formation. That is my two thumbs and my two pointers to slowly squeeze the clay inwards. After collaring, I start at the shoulder and pull the clay up in the neck. This allows me to pull up the neck a little more. When I'm collaring, the clay is thickening a little, and it can also create a bit of a twist. Pulling the clay up after collaring helps thin the clay and even it out. So alternate between the two. Collaring and then pulling the clay up. Take your time colouring in. I'm speeding this part of the video up quite a bit, so it looks like I make bottles super fast, more so that viewers don't fall asleep. The technique of colouring is really useful for making enclosed forms. So you keep on colouring until the clay meets up and you close off the form. Now I just want to refine the shape of the neck a little. I'm going to use a rib to get that gentle curve that I'm after. So you can see this flexible rib is probably the one tool that I wouldn't do without. And now I'm just going to use it to refine the curve of the shoulder and the body of the bottle. This is a really simple shape, so I want a pretty straight-sided bottle with a gentle shoulder and a longish narrow neck. So because I'm throwing on a bat, I'm not going to wire through my bottle immediately. So once I've finished, I'll just let my bottle dry on the bat and then wire through, maybe after a few hours. It just makes the bottle easier to move around. Now that my bottle's leather hard, I'm thinking about how I'm going to trim. It's pretty difficult to fasten a bottle to the wheel, so I am going to use a chuck. So a chuck is just a thrown form that allows you to position a bottle or other shape to trim. It's helpful if you make your chuck at the same time you make the bottle. That way you can think about the shape of the neck of the bottle. So I'm going to show you how to quickly make a chuck. Center a piece of clay. Here I'm using about 600 grams of clay. And flatten the top. Now push down. And you can push right through to the bat if you want. I find it useful to throw chucks on bats because then I can move them around easily and bring up the walls of your chuck. So I need to think about the neck. I need to make a section narrow that's going to hold the neck and bring the top of the chuck out so that the shoulder will sit in the chuck. So there are a couple of ways of using your chuck. You can use it at leather hard stage, or you can let it dry. You can also bisque fire your chuck and then use it forever. I actually like to, if I'm making a series, I like to use my chuck for the whole series and then let it dry and bisque fire. But I prefer using it leather hard. It just does a little less damage to the neck of the bottle. So I pop my bottle upside down in the chuck when they're both leather hard, and then I can just trim the top. So I don't really need a foot ring on these bottles. I'm just going to trim so that they're a little concave. They sit nicely on a table. So I've made bottles like this before where I haven't actually trimmed. I've just smoothed around the edge and across the base. That's been sufficient. But knowing how to make and use a chuck is a pretty useful skill, especially if you're making lots of narrow neck bottles or other slightly awkward forms when it comes to trimming. So now I'm just smoothing the base to give it a nice finish and we're done. I just sponge a little to get a great finish, and then I'm going to let them dry. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to reuse my chuck for more bottles. So I cover it and set it aside so I can keep on trimming. As I mentioned earlier, bottles look great in a set. There's something about the repetition. Sets of bottles with different dimensions and proportions can also look very expressive. As always, thanks for watching. If you haven't subscribed, please consider subscribing. It's much appreciated. Like and comment below, and as usual, happy potting.